Okay, get this. We're basically time travelers today, but without a DeLorean. You know those articles you sent us about melting glaciers in the Alps? Wild stuff. We're talking ancient artifacts, climate change clues, even maybe pandemic risks. This deep dive is going to be a wild ride, so buckle up.
It is fascinating stuff. There's like this surge of archaeological discoveries in the Alps happening right now, specifically from melting ice patches.
Okay, so ice patches, not glaciers. What's the difference?
Good question. Think of glaciers like slow-moving rivers of ice. You know, they crush up pretty much anything in their path. But ice patches, those are different. They just kind of stay put for centuries, millennia even, like giant freezers, perfectly preserving whatever gets trapped inside.
So kind of like opening a time capsule from, say, the Bronze Age.
Precisely. One of the articles actually talked about this site, Lucha Pass in Switzerland, and archaeologists are finding the coolest things. A wooden box, perfectly preserved, filled with cereal grains, bows and arrows, even a medieval cow skeleton.
Hold up. A medieval cow skeleton. What was a cow doing all the way up in the Alps? Like, was it a medieval hiking buddy or something?
Well, it seems more like this pass was a well-traveled route for centuries. I mean, think about it. You've got Bronze Age travelers, medieval farmers, all using the same paths. The cow skeleton, along with all the other artifacts, really point to that.
So maybe more like a medieval traffic jam than a hiking trip, huh? But what's really amazing is how well preserved everything is. Even things like birch bark that would normally decompose are totally intact because of the ice. I can see why archaeologists are geeking out over this. It's like a window into the past. But there's a bit of a bittersweet feeling to this, right? I mean, it's only happening because the ice is melting so fast.
Yeah, that's the dark side of this, isn't it? That other article you sent paints a pretty sobering picture of what's going on in the Alps because of climate change. In 2022 alone, Switzerland lost a crazy amount of glacial ice, about 6% of its total volume. And that's three times the average melt rate over the last decade.
3 times. Wow, that's huge.
It is, unfortunately, and it's not just a Swiss problem either. It's affecting the whole Alpine region. Some projections even say up to 95% of those glaciers could be gone by the end of the century.
95%. That's basically all of them. What kind of impact is that going to have? I mean, besides making it harder to find those ancient treasures.
Well, the impacts are going to be pretty widespread, right? Glaciers are they're super important sources of fresh water for drinking, for irrigation, for hydroelectric power. Losing them would have a huge impact on everything: agriculture, energy production, tourism, you name it.
And not to mention the dangers, right? The article mentioned that tragic incident on Mont Blanc last year where that massive icefall killed several hikers.
Yeah, that was a terrible reminder of how climate change is literally reshaping these mountains, making them less stable, more unpredictable. And it's not just Europe either. We're seeing similar things in other places that rely on glaciers, like the Himalayas, where the melt is contributing to these devastating floods.
So melting ice is uncovering the past, but it's also giving us a glimpse into what could be a very different future. There was something else in that article, though, that I thought was really interesting, the impact on the balance of life in those glacier-fed rivers.
That's a crucial point, and one that people don't always think about. As glaciers melt, the rivers they feed become warmer, and in some cases, they can even start to dry up. That's a big problem for the species that have evolved to live in those cold, pristine environments.
Okay, so we're not just talking about, like, polar bears and stuff. What kind of creatures are we talking about?
We're talking about the tiny but mighty creatures that keep those ecosystems running, invertebrates. Things like the stonefly, Rhabdiopteryx, and all sorts of non-biting midges. They may be small, but they're a vital part of the food chain there.
And their role is?
They're the base of the food pyramid, essentially. They're food for fish, amphibians, birds. As their habitat shrinks, it affects the whole food web.
It's kind of like pulling a thread on a sweater. The whole thing starts to unravel.
Exactly. And to make matters worse, a lot of these species can't just pick up and move to a new river if their home gets too warm. They evolve to live in those specific conditions.
So we could be looking at extinctions. That's never good. Which brings us to that thing we teased at the beginning, the risk of a pandemic hiding in the ice. Now things are getting a bit spooky.
It is a bit unsettling. Remember permafrost, that permanently frozen ground that covers a huge chunk of the northern hemisphere? Well, as it thaws, and it is thawing because of climate change, it's not just releasing trapped carbon, which is bad enough, it's also releasing ancient viruses and bacteria that have been locked away for millennia.
Wait, hold on. Ancient viruses. like straight out of a zombie movie.
Not zombies, but the idea is kind of similar. These are pathogens that haven't seen the light of day for thousands of years. And there's a worry that as they thaw, they could infect new hosts, including humans.
Okay, now I'm a little freaked out. How real is this risk? Are we talking like pandemic level stuff?
A pandemic isn't guaranteed, but it is a very real concern that scientists are taking seriously. There was a study just back in 2022 that found a link between glacial meltwater and a higher risk of virus transfer.
So more melting ice means more chances for these ancient viruses to escape and potentially cause problems.
It's a valid worry, and we know it's not just theoretical. Scientists have already found viruses that are 15,000 years old in Tibetan ice. And get this, in a French lab, researchers actually revived a 30,000-year-old virus from Siberian permafrost.
They revived it. Okay, yeah, maybe those ancient viruses should just stay frozen. This is serious stuff, though. We're talking about melting glaciers, giving us a window into the past, but also maybe unleashing threats that could impact our future.
Yeah, it really highlights how everything's connected, doesn't it? And the huge impact climate change is having. What happens in the Alps or the Arctic permafrost doesn't stay there. It affects all of us.
We've covered a lot in this deep dive already. It's a lot to process. But before we keep going, let's just take a moment to really think about what we've learned so far.
We've been talking about some pretty heavy stuff, like ancient viruses and ecosystems getting disrupted. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are things that people are doing and things you can do to help.
Okay, less doom scrolling,
Yeah.
more doing. I like that. But first, gotta ask, what are we even supposed to do about ancient viruses and permafrost? Do we stock up on hand sanitizer and call it a day?
Well, hand sanitizer is never a bad idea. But on a larger scale, it really comes down to two things: monitoring and research. Scientists are always studying these ancient pathogens, trying to understand what kind of threat they could pose.
So it's like getting ahead of the curve, learning as much as possible before these viruses become a problem. But how do they even study viruses that have been frozen for thousands of years?
That's what makes this research so cool. Scientists use all sorts of techniques, like gene sequencing, to analyze the genetic material of these viruses. They can actually rebuild the viral genomes and compare them to modern viruses to see how they've changed. And sometimes they even revive these ancient viruses in a lab.
Revive them. Isn't that a bit risky? Like, what if one escapes?
It sounds scary, I know. But these labs are super high-tech with tons of safety protocols. Think of it like Fort Knox for viruses. And the reason they revive them is to study them in a safe environment, figure out how they behave, how they might interact with modern cells.
Okay, understand the enemy and all that. But what about the glaciers themselves? Is there anything we can do to slow down the melting? I've heard of people covering them with those reflective blankets, but that seems like a tiny fix for a huge problem.
You're right. Those local efforts are kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. They might buy us some time, but they're not a long-term solution. The reality is what happens to these glaciers depends on what happens to our planet's climate.
So, back to climate change. It's such a big, complicated issue. I mean, what can we actually do about it? So many solutions seem like they're either too small, like those glacier blankets, or too big to even grasp, like global treaties and stuff.
It can be overwhelming, I get it. But it's important to remember that what one person does, well, when millions of people do it, that can create huge change. It's about making different choices in our lives. Things like reducing our carbon footprint, buying sustainable products, supporting businesses that are trying to be more eco-friendly.
Okay, but what kind of choices? Get specific.
It could be something as simple as walking or biking instead of driving, choosing energy-efficient appliances, or just being more aware of how much energy you use at home. Little things, but they add up.
So all those little things can actually make a difference.
They really can. Think about it. If everyone started making those small changes, it would change what people want, what companies make, how things are done.
Okay, I see that. But what about those little creatures we talked about? The stoneflies and midges that are losing their homes in those rivers. Is there any hope for them?
Their future is tied to what happens to those glaciers and those rivers. And that brings us right back to how important it is to fight climate change. Not just for the ice itself, but for all the life that depends on it.
So it's not just about polar bears and melting ice caps. Climate change is impacting, the tiniest creatures in the most unexpected places. But what about those big solutions, the ones beyond just what I do in my own life?
That's what politics comes in. It's about voting for people who care about climate change, supporting policies that promote clean energy, holding corporations accountable for what they do to the environment, using your voice and your vote to demand change.
So it's not just about changing my light bulbs, it's about changing the whole system. But how do we get people to listen?
It starts with staying informed. Learn about what's happening, talk to people, support groups that are working on climate change, advocate for policies, and make sure your elected officials know what you care about.
Okay, starting to see the big picture here. It's not just about science or politics, it's about, like, everything. Our values, our choices, what we owe to each other and to the planet.
You got it. The choices we make, together and as individuals, will decide what happens to these alpine treasures and really the future of our planet.
Deep breaths, everyone. This is a lot, but it feels like we're starting to see a way forward. We've gone from ancient discoveries to potential plagues to things we can actually do to make things better. It's a wild ride, but it's a ride we're all on.
And that's an important point. This isn't something for future generations to deal with. It's happening now, and it needs all of us to act right now.
Absolutely. So before we wrap up this deep dive, let's think about this question that's come up. If melting ice is revealing our past and showing us what the future might be like, what responsibility do we have to find that balance? We've talked about all the sciencey stuff about melting glaciers, the risks, even some solutions. But now I kind of want to get a little philosophical. This whole idea that melting ice is like showing us the past and hinting at the future. What does that mean for what we're supposed to do? What's our responsibility here?
It's a question that's on everyone's mind. Archaeologists, scientists, all of us, really. I mean, think about it. We have this incredible chance to uncover history, right? To learn about these past cultures and what the environment was like thousands of years ago. It's something we couldn't even have imagined just a few decades ago.
Right. It's like those glaciers are like time machines, giving us a glimpse of a world that was literally frozen in time.
Yeah.
But like you said before, there's this bittersweet side to it all. We're only seeing these discoveries because of a crisis that we created.
Exactly. And it brings up some pretty complex questions, like, is it enough to just document and study these artifacts as they melt out of the ice? Or do we have to try to preserve them, even if it means slowing down the research?
I bet archaeologists are feeling a bit like Indiana Jones right now, racing to collect these treasures before they're gone forever.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of urgency. But it's not just about the objects themselves, it's about what they can teach us. Every single artifact, every piece of birch bark, every grain of wheat, it all tells a story. And as those things disappear, as the ice melts, those stories are gone.
So we have a responsibility to the past, to make sure these pieces of history aren't lost so future generations can learn from them. But we've also got all these challenges right now and these risks for the future, like, those ancient viruses. So knowing all that, what does it say about what we owe to the people who come after us?
That's where things get really important, I think. We're not just watching this happen, we're actually part of shaping the world that future generations are going to live in. And knowing that, it means we have to act.
So it's not just about digging up the past, it's about making the future.
Exactly. We have to learn from what's happened before to see how our choices have consequences. And then we have to make different choices, to create a world that's sustainable and fair for everyone.
I like that, learning from the past to make a better future. But it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this. What can one person actually do? It feels like a drop in the bucket.
I get it. The challenges are huge. But what one person does, when it's multiplied by millions of people, that's a powerful force. It starts with being aware, making choices in our lives to reduce our impact on the planet, and then speaking up. Using your voice to make things better.
Right. We talked about some of those choices, like taking public transport, saving energy, and buying sustainable things. But how do we move beyond just individual actions? How do we change the system?
That's where getting involved in politics matters. Vote for people who will prioritize climate action, support policies that encourage clean energy and sustainable practices, hold corporations accountable for their environmental footprint. Those are all crucial steps in building a better world.
So it's personal actions and collective action. Changing our habits, but also pushing for bigger changes that get to the root of the problem.
That's it. And realizing that we're all in this together. Our choices have ripple effects. They impact everyone. What we do today matters for tomorrow.
This has been amazing. We've explored so much. The science, the risks, the solutions, even these big ethical questions. Melting glaciers are more than just some science thing, right? They're a powerful reminder of how our planet's changing and that we have to act.
I couldn't agree more. They remind us that we're all connected. We have a responsibility to each other and to this planet that we all share.
To the listener who sent us down this rabbit hole, thank you. You've really made us think and consider, what part we play in creating a better future.
And to everyone listening, remember, the future isn't something that just happens to us. We make it. So let's make it a good one.
And that's a wrap on this deep dive. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning. And most importantly, take care of yourselves and each other.